As Americans, we are taught from an early age to value the study of history as a vital part of our education and our identity as a nation. Study of the American West has been extensive. The number of books published is second only to those written about the Civil War. But within all those volumes, references to African Americans are extremely rare. Today, historians are rediscovering the contributions of African Americans, recognizing their impact as a people, and exploring race relations as they played out in the Wild West. In this 5-part series, Professor Quintard Taylor focuses on African American history in terms of forming communities, combating racism, and changing social and political patterns in the development of the American West. The African American West is presented by the University of Washington's College of Arts and Sciences and the UW Alumni Association. Major funding for this program was provided by Macy's, continuing its long-term commitment to promoting Black history by making this video series available to secondary schools throughout Washington State. Additional funding was provided by the University Bookstore and UW-Medicine. This decade was a period of profound transformation as 500,000 African Americans migrated into the West to join the 1.3 million already there. This lecture will explore the campaign for racial justice and assess its impact on all Westerners. Additional funding for this lecture was provided by Liberty Mutual.
Good evening. I'm Carver Gayton, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture. This is the 4th evening in the series, The African American West, 1528 to 2000. A few acknowledgments I'd like to make at this point. We want to once again thank those of you who are members of the University of Washington Alumni Association, as your membership support makes this series possible. If you're not a member, please consider becoming one to continue the support of the great programs that the Alumni Association has. Throughout time, African American history has been overlooked, but through partnership and collaboration, we are changing that. Quintard Taylor's research here at the university is vital in advancing knowledge about the African American experience. The website that he shared with you a couple weeks ago is very popular. In the week of January 21st through the 28th, there were 8,000 visits to his website. And although 95% of them originated on the computers in the United States, over 30 countries were represented in international visits. As I mentioned, I am the director of the Northwest African American Museum, so sharing history is something that's very important with regard to the museum. We incorporate aspects of African American history and culture in the public school curriculum also. That's something that's extremely important to us. That's a major goal. I think it's interesting to note that Carter Woodson, back in 1926, started Negro History Week. And then it was 50 years later, started Negro History Month, or African American History Month. It took us 50 years to get to that point. One of the things I think that's extremely important, it's wonderful that we celebrate Black History Month, but it looks like if you look at the calculations, it's going to take about 600 years for us to be able to have African American history incorporated within our curricula on a whole year basis. And that was what Woodson's direction was. He wanted to make sure that we had that incorporated throughout the entire year and where it was appropriate. Establishing the Northwest African American Museum has been a goal of this community for many years. Especially, it's been the goal to have it at the old Coleman School, many of you have seen on 23rd and Jackson. It's had its fits and starts in relation to developing that museum, but the leadership vacuum of establishing the museum was provided by the direction and the vision of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, and especially James Kelly, who is the CEO of the Urban League. And so what they decided to do about 6 years ago, they said, we're going to purchase that building, which they have done. They said, we want to have housing, affordable housing on the top 2 floors of that building, and also on the ground floor to have the Northwest African American Museum, which encompasses almost 18,000 square feet. So we are moving in a very positive direction. In fact, we will be breaking ground in May of this year for the renovation of the museum, and all of the construction will be finished in the summer of 2007. So we are making progress, very good progress with regard to something that the entire community has been interested in. But now, moving forward with regard to Quintard, who I've known for many years. He gave me a call when he was at the University of Oregon back almost 16 years ago about something he wanted to find out about Seattle. I hope I was able to help him. I remember in one of his books there was a notation of it, so I guess he did remember what we talked about. This series is about the role of African Americans in the shaping of the American West, but it's also about the leaders of that day. Their actions brought value to our region, not just for the African American community, but for the greater community. These people contributed to the economy of the area, art and music, the life of the region. We all benefit from the richness of our diversity. And I thank you all for celebrating this history with us tonight. Quintard Taylor is also a leader. He is a leader in his fields of teaching research, a leader in presenting multicultural history to people throughout the world, and a leader in our community here at home. Please join me in welcoming back for another evening of this compelling series, Quintard Taylor.
Thank you, Carver. That's wonderful. Folks, you are the tough ones. You're here for presentation number 4, and I commend you. Before I get started, I just want to say a couple of things about the way we're going to proceed this evening, but also, given the fact that Carver gave this wonderful introduction, I just want to say again publicly, he has done a remarkable job in terms of bringing this community together behind the African American Museum, and I think he deserves a round of applause. You know, we historians have a symbiotic relationship with museums. I don't think we can exist very long without them, and I know they can't exist very long without us. And of course, we've been working with the museum. We will continue to work with the museum, and I'm waiting for the structure to be ready to the opening night, the opening day, so that all of us can take advantage of this history. What we do here today is just a moment in time. The museum is a permanent structure that's a tribute to African American history, and in this instance, African American history in the Pacific Northwest. And so he's doing, and the staff are doing a remarkable job in making sure that what we talk about tonight is going to be part of the permanent record, the permanent history of this region. Let me begin. World War II was a pivotal moment in the history of the Pacific Coast. First, there was the spectacular population growth of the region as 4 million newcomers arrived as military personnel and defense industries in the states along the Pacific Coast. I dare say that many of you in this room tonight are descendants of people who came to the West during that time period. But the region was also important nationally for the first time in the 1940s because it emerged as a major center for industrial production. Now, to be sure, there were factories here in the Pacific Northwest before 1941, but by 1945, we had clearly established ourselves as a major center for not only the production of war materials, but also materials that will continue to be important in peacetime. Indeed, to put this in perspective, the city that ranked #1 in the country in terms of war production, that is the material for war, between 1942 and 1945, was Detroit. And we can understand that. But the city that was #2 was Los Angeles. And the city that ranked #3 in the country was Seattle. So Los Angeles and Seattle and the West, and particularly the West Coast, literally came of age in terms of industrialization. But I'll argue, and I'll certainly do this for the rest of the evening, that the migration of nearly 400,000 African Americans to California, to Washington, to Oregon in the 1940s also represented a profound change which made these states, for good or ill, increasingly similar to the rest of the United States. Black migrants headed for 6 major West Coast destinations: Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, and Portland, Vancouver. Of these, Portland, Vancouver grew faster than any other metropolitan area in terms of its African American population. It grew by 1,100%. What you see on the board here, what you see on the screen, is an increase of, where is Portland? An increase of 393%, which is prodigious. But between 1941 and 1945, Portland's black population increased from about 1,900 to 22,000. We'll talk about why Portland lost some of those people a little bit later on in the lecture. But Portland, Vancouver holds the distinction as the metropolitan region with the largest wartime percentage increase in its black population in the entire country. Put another way, Black Portland grew, as I said before, from 1,900 in 1940 to approximately 22,000 in 1945, while Black Vancouver grew from 12 to 3,000 during those same years. Moreover, by 1945, 97% of the African Americans in Oregon lived in Portland. That's sort of scary when you think about it, but 97% of the African Americans in Oregon lived in Portland. But there were other examples of change that came in the Second World War. That war brought a migration which permanently altered race relations as the newcomers, the black newcomers especially, demanded the social freedom and the political rights denied them in their former homes in the South and sometimes even in the East. Secondly, the migration increased black political influence as reflected in the election of state legislators and city council members. For example, W. Byron Rumford was elected to the California legislature from Berkeley in 1948. Now, he wasn't a migrant himself, but his political rise, the rise of his ability to run for office and win office, to a large extent had to do with the influx of blacks into Northern California, and particularly into Berkeley. Also, State Representative Charles Stokes, who many of you are somewhat familiar with, I'm sure, was elected in 1950, and when he was elected, he became the first black elected official from Seattle. Not the first black elected official in the state, but the first black elected official from Seattle. Thirdly, the migration strengthened civil rights organizations such as the NAACP and encouraged the enactment of anti-discrimination legislation in Washington, in Oregon, and California. Now, that didn't come easily. Indeed, we could give a whole lecture on the struggles to try to bring about anti-discrimination legislation in each of these states. But the very fact that those struggles began in the 1940s, I think is indicative of the changes going on that were brought by the migration. Portland's NAACP, which by the way was one of the first that was established west of the Mississippi River, tripled from about 500 members in 1941 to 1,500 members by the end of the war. But Seattle's NAACP grew even more spectacularly. Seattle's numbers rose from 85 members in 1941 to 1,500 members in 1945. And of course, with the rise of the NAACP in both places, we see what I call an increasing militancy on the part of African Americans. As these black people recognize not only their crucial role in war production, but they also recognize the fact that they had to be engaged in the struggle for full democratization in American society. But I will say something else here. Not only did they realize they had to be engaged in struggle, for the first time, they also realized that they had a powerful ally in the federal government. And we'll talk about that in some detail, but let me give you just one example. In the 1940s, indeed, in 1942, as a consequence of Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, or the FEPC, was set up. Now, I will say to you that it didn't do all that it promised to do, it didn't do all that it was expected to do, but it certainly did a lot more than had happened before. Indeed, the FEPC was the first federal agency specifically set up to do battle against racial discrimination since the Freedmen's Bureau of the Reconstruction period. In other words, there was a turning of the direction of the nation, and that turning process began, I believe, with the Second World War. But the migration also increased racial tension as the interaction of settlers and natives, and of whites and blacks and Latinos and Asians generated violence in Los Angeles and in San Francisco and in Portland and right here in Seattle. This included not just black-white tension, as you see reflected here in terms of, the white native and the black migrant in Oakland in 1942. It also reflects the rise in tensions between and among people of color. And if time permits, I'll try to talk about some of that as it worked its way out in Seattle. But finally, there were tensions that arose within the African American community. Now, I won't suggest to you that the black community was completely unified before 1941, but certainly with the rise of the migration, there would be tremendous social tensions and social pressures that would emerge within that community, some of which I would suggest are felt right to this very day. Indeed, as the migrants came in from the South, they were going to see themselves in juxtaposition against what were called the old settlers, and the old settlers were essentially anyone who arrived before 1941. And there had to be an adjustment. There had to be a working out process, and we'll try to explore that working out process later in the lecture. A series of events thousands of miles away would eventually spark this profound transformation in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, you see on the map where those events are taking place. The rise of Nazi Germany, the rise of Imperial Japan, and the world being cast into war by 1939. But I would argue that there are events that are taking place within our own country that also help to lead to the change in the Pacific Northwest. And those events can best be described as part of what will be known as the Double V campaign, or the Double Victory campaign. And the man you see pictured here is James G. Thompson, who is, I think, perhaps as responsible as any single individual for raising that issue and mounting that campaign. Thompson was an ordinary black American, and I like to use that phrase because we like to think in terms of superlatives. We like to think of the grand leaders like Du Bois or let's say Adam Clayton Powell and the like in the 1930s and 1940s. But I would suggest to you that there were ordinary African Americans who were going to be as responsible for much of the significant change that would take place. And Thompson was one of them. He was a cafeteria worker in Wichita, Kansas, at the Cessna plant there. He was a person who knew that at that moment he couldn't work as a production worker in the Cessna plant because there were no blacks in production in almost any of these plants across the country. He also knew that the war was coming, and indeed, by 1942, the war was there, and it was already going on in terms of the involvement of the United States. And he wrote a remarkable letter on January 31st, 1942, to the Pittsburgh Courier. And I can't put the entire letter up, but I want you to see some of what he said. Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship in exchange for sacrificing my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending? Some could argue that this almost bordered on treason, but he was talking about something else. He was talking about the fact that in every single war that had occurred in the history of the United States, African Americans had been called upon to sacrifice. African Americans had shed their blood in defense of the country, only to come back to a country that often turned its back on them in terms of political rights. And so his question was profound. And it was answered with his statement at the end. Let we colored Americans adopt the double V. The first V is for victory over our enemies from without, meaning the Nazis, meaning the fascists, meaning the Japanese. But the second V is for victory over our enemies within. And here he was talking about what many people would call the domestic fascists, the racists in America at the time. Thompson's letter was well publicized by the African American press. It became a rallying cry for the Double V campaign that millions of blacks were going to participate in, millions of blacks would embrace throughout the 1940s. But I would suggest to you that Thompson simply gave a name to a campaign which had already begun. By 1940, African Americans realized that the Arsenal for Democracy was quite willing to exclude them as workers, as significant workers. While millions of white Americans were getting jobs in defense plants throughout the country in 1940 and 1941, and right here in Seattle, the number of whites being employed at Boeing was essentially growing in the thousands, almost the tens of thousands by 1942. Yet African Americans were barred from almost every position except those of janitors. In January 1941, A. Philip Randolph toured the country, and he saw firsthand the continued and persistent complaints of defense industry discrimination. He surveyed 120 defense plants, employing collectively over 100,000 people. And what he found out, he wasn't surprised at what he found out, but he was saddened by what he learned. What he found out was that there were only 237 African Americans employed in all of those plants, and every last one of them was a janitor. Randolph's findings were confirmed by the defense employers themselves. The president of North American Aviation in Los Angeles said in early 1941, in response to the inquiries from Randolph and others, and I want to read this. I wish I had an overhead for this, but I want to read this to you. While we are in complete sympathy with the Negro, it is against company policy to employ them as mechanics or aircraft workers. There will be some jobs as janitors for Negroes. But regardless of their training as aircraft workers, in other words, blacks were already beginning to get some training in some schools across the country as aircraft workers. Regardless of their training as aircraft workers, we will not employ them in North American plants. And here he means in the plants of North American Aviation. Folks, I can duplicate this statement for every one of the major aviation companies and almost every one of the major defense contractors in the country in 1940 and 1941. Randolph addressed the Civil Rights Convention in Chicago with his findings. Again, no one's very much surprised at this. Everybody knew what was going on. And it was here that the idea of a March on Washington began. And of course, what you see here is the March on Washington movement, a movement that evolves out of this discussion. And this is, again, a kind of a tribute to ordinary people. At this convention, there was a great deal of discussion about what should be done and how it should be done. And one unidentified female delegate, we don't know, obviously we don't know who she is to this day, said, and I'm quoting here, "We ought to throw 50,000 Negroes around the White House. We ought to bring them in from all over the country in jalopies and trains, any way they can get there, until we get some action," and here she means on the integration of defense plants, "from the White House." In other words, direct protest. And again, this is direct protest that's not coming from on high, not coming from the leadership. It's coming essentially from the ground up. It's coming from ordinary people who are getting tired of the racial oppression that's been going on. Randolph pursued her suggestion and called for a march on Washington of 50,000 blacks to protest employment discrimination, and he slated that march to take place on July 1st, 1941. This would have been, to that point, the single largest demonstration in the history of the nation's capital. It would have also been a major embarrassment to the United States. Remember, we were at that time engaged in a huge propaganda war. The fighting hadn't started yet between us and the Nazis, but we were engaged in a huge propaganda war. And we were presenting ourselves, as I said before, as the arsenal for democracy, the arsenal of democracy. We were presenting ourselves as a symbol of democratic liberty in a nation, or excuse me, in a world that was increasingly turning toward tyranny. And yet, our liberty was not being extended to a significant segment of the population. I would suggest to you, as Franklin Roosevelt realized at the time, that the Nazis would have had a field day with this. They would have been able to talk about American hypocrisy, much to the embarrassment of the United States and its allies. In an unprecedented move, Franklin Roosevelt sat down with Randolph in the White House on June 25th, 1941. Following that meeting, and it's a very interesting meeting, but we don't have time. I don't have time to go into it. But following that meeting, he issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in the defense industries. Again, this is a first. This is the first time the federal government has, since 1875, taken action, taken affirmative action, if I can use that phrase, to try to deal with racial discrimination. Later on, Roosevelt would create, as I mentioned before, the Fair Employment Practices Committee to monitor that discrimination. Again, the first time an agency like this was established since right after the Civil War. Executive Order 8802, combined with the labor shortage that surely would come once we entered the war, led to tremendous black employment gains during the Second World War. As a matter of fact, historians debate whether or not most of the gains came from the executive order or whether they came from the shortage of labor. I don't know the answer to this. What I know is perhaps it's the combination of the two that would spark unprecedented opportunity for African Americans, as you're going to see in a minute. Nearly 4 million black people before the end of the war would be employed in defense industries in a variety of capacities. In other words, they would work for the very men who in 1941 were saying, we will never hire them. In fact, World War II, supported by Executive Order 8802, generated what I call a new Great Migration, as 1.2 million African Americans took to the road to find new employment opportunities all over the country. Now, we know part of this story. Many of them headed for war production centers in Chicago and Detroit and Mobile, Alabama, and Norfolk, Virginia. However, but the most dramatic growth was going to be on the West Coast. About 31% of the African Americans who moved in the years of the Second World War came to Washington, to Oregon, and to California. 31%, 1/3 of the population that moved came here, came to the West. Between 1941 and 1950, the black population of Washington, Oregon, and California grew from 124,000 to 494,000. But to put this in perspective, guys, and many of you are probably not familiar with the first Great Migration during the World War I years. That's the time when blacks left the South in huge numbers, almost 500,000. Well, let me suggest to you that the second migration to the West Coast alone is almost as large as the first migration, the first Great Migration that historians often talk about. In other words, something powerful, something dynamic was taking place. And for the first time, it was involving this region of the country, particularly in terms of African Americans. Getting here proved the first challenge. Many migrants followed hot, dusty stretches of US Highway 80 and Route 66, made famous 10 years earlier by the Dust Bowl migration. They came across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, and then up California's Central Valley on their way to Portland and on their way to Seattle. They came with, and I'm going to use the words of one historian, their mementos, history, and hope, all tied to the top of a car. Since few hotels along the route accommodated black people, migrants took turns driving and they camped by the roadside. On occasion, they stayed in African American homes along the route in Amarillo, in Albuquerque, in Flagstaff, in Los Angeles, and even in San Francisco. Train travelers faced 4 days on crowded, uncomfortable cars. And here's the situation with the trains. If one was coming from the South, if one was coming from Texas, one rode a segregated car to the border. And the border, in this instance, would be El Paso. Once you reached El Paso, you could then move around in your cars. But up until the moment you reached El Paso, those coming from Louisiana, those coming from farther east, all of those people had to ride segregated cars. There's one example of Bertha Walker, again, one of those ordinary black people, who in 1943 rode out of Texas on a Jim Crow car, as she remembered. And she recalled changing trains in El Paso. And at that moment, a white soldier gave up his seat to her, saying, "You can relax now. We're at the Mason-Dixon line. You can relax now. We're at the Mason-Dixon line." I hadn't realized until I read that the Mason-Dixon line stretched all the way down to El Paso and the Mexican border. But understand, we're talking about the definition of the South, and that definition is writ large by the racial policies that existed in Texas at that time. Black people were coming, and as they came, there was growing anxiety, and you're gonna see examples of that anxiety all over the place. Indeed, this huge influx was of growing concern to those who were already here, both whites and blacks. And indeed, there was a little quote that came out of the period, and I don't know where it originated from, but it sort of symbolized this sense of anxiety, this growing concern about this huge migration that was taking place. The quote goes like this: "The state of Arkansas has moved to California. The state of Texas has moved to California. And California has gone to hell." And you can see from these figures, you can see what was going on. I need not explain to you these huge population increases, these surges in population. I mean, these were places This is unlike the first Great Migration up to the north in 1916, 1917, 1918, where African Americans were actually coming into pre-existing communities. In many, many instances in the West, they came to communities that didn't have any black folks at all. Vallejo, California. And even look at the figures for Bremerton or Pasco or Vancouver. Vancouver, Washington, 12 in 1940, and actually 4,000 by 1945. These are huge influxes. In this particular instance, there's no conflict between the old settlers and the newcomers. The newcomers are the only people there. You know, they are the ones who are going to set the standard. But in other places, like San Francisco and Seattle, there will be a conflict. I'm going to actually veer from the text and just show you some images. We often, when we talk about the Great Migration, and I've certainly done it over the years, the Great Migration of World War II, we focus on Los Angeles, or we show slides of San Francisco and Oakland, but I think there are more interesting places that are much closer to home. How about Sinclair Park in Bremerton, Washington? How about another shot from Bremerton, Washington? Sinclair Park. I don't know how many of you have even heard of Sinclair Park, but Sinclair Park was a housing project that was built expressly for African Americans who came to Bremerton in the World War II period. And it became a vibrant community and continued to be a vibrant community until it was dismantled in 1948. But as you saw in the previous slide, it was the first home in the West for a very young Quincy Jones. And it was also the first home for a number of other African Americans, some of whom eventually ended up in Seattle, and some of whom will probably have descendants in this room tonight. Let me give you one other. And I don't know if this fits at all with my lecture, but I thought it was a great photo. These are Seattle pinup girls. I found this, let me make an aside here, guys. I found this in the National Archives. I was browsing the website of the National Archives looking for representative photos of the Pacific Northwest, and this is the only one they had. and so I was forced to use it. Let me give you a bit of information. Let me give you a footnote. The woman on the far left, and some of you may actually identify, you may actually know her. The woman on the far left is Jean McIver Harris. She is the aunt of Councilman McIver. And I had to confirm this with him just to make sure that I had the information straight. But she is one of the people who were part of this community. Now, and what you have here is a very interesting situation. These were both newcomers and old-timers. In other words, this is one of those rare photographs where the newcomers were actually integrated with the old-timers. That often did not happen, but nonetheless, it's symbolic of the kind of process that was taking place in the Pacific Northwest at the time. I'm gonna focus our attention for a few minutes on not Seattle, but our sister city to the south, Portland. In some ways, Portland, Oregon represents even a more dramatic change in terms of its social structure, in terms of its politics, in terms of its very existence as a result of the influx of African Americans, in part because Portland, Oregon would actually get a lot more black people than Seattle. Portland would have, as I think I said before, 22,000 African Americans by 1945, as opposed to only 10,000 in Seattle. And of course, the reason for that, let me be very clear, the reason for that is Kaiser. The reason for that are the Kaiser shipyards. Portland, Oregon offers stark testimony on the rise of the black Pacific Northwest. As I said before, the impact of the migration is going to loom large, not just on the migrants themselves and not just on the blacks in Portland who were there before, but on the entire city. Before World War II, virtually every black person who worked in Portland was either a maid or a janitor. Let me repeat that. Before World War II, virtually every black person who worked in Portland was a maid or a janitor. By 1945, 95% of the black workers in Portland were engaged in shipyard work for the 3 Kaiser yards. In other words, the script had been completely flipped. All of these black folks who had been working in kitchens before were now working in the shipyards, and they were making more money, as you can imagine, than they had ever dreamed. Let me give you some background on this. In 1941, even before the United States got into the war, California industrialist Henry J. Kaiser decided that in order to get prepared for the coming conflict, he had better, and meaning his company, had better expand shipyard building facilities, not just in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area, but also to have a second major area for production in the Pacific Northwest. They chose Portland, and it was an important move. Certainly it was an important move for Portland's economy. The shipyards in Portland were going to be enormous. There would be 2 shipyards, and well, you can see a couple of these. There's the shipyard, the Kaiser Yard in Vancouver on the right. There's the Kaiser Yard in St. John's or Portland on the left. I think I've got a map here. Yeah, this is perfect. You can see where the 3 major shipyards were located. Vancouver, Oregon Shipbuilding, and then Swan Island. You can see Swan Island. Those were the 3 major shipyards, all organized by that man, by Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser could arguably be said to have been the most powerful man in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe one of the most powerful men in Washington. As you're going to see in a minute, when he had conflicts with the state of Oregon, with the city of Portland, he went around both to the President of the United States. And usually Henry Kaiser got what he wanted from the President of the United States. Here he's with Eleanor Roosevelt, but a lot of people take pictures with Eleanor Roosevelt. But Kaiser has real power, as you're going to see in a minute. As I said before, these shipyards were nothing short of enormous. By 1943, nearly 100,000 people worked in the 3 Portland shipyards. In fact, more people worked in the Portland shipyards than worked in the Kaiser yards in California. Or to put it in perspective, 100,000 people working for these 3 shipyards in the Portland area, because many of them worked on the Vancouver side. 100,000 people working in the Portland yards is a far cry from the 18,000 people who work in the largest factory in Oregon today. In other words, there were far more people working for Kaiser in World War II than there are people working for any single factory, any single production service in Oregon right to this day. The Kaiser people would bring in a lot of folks. They would recruit all over, and included in that recruitment would be 8,000 African Americans. And by the end of the war, they would comprise almost 9% of the overall shipyard workforce. However, they were 96% of all the black workers in the city. Let me show you a Kaiser ad. Kaiser, as one memo stated, and I won't get into it here, but Kaiser scoured the city. As the memo stated, they were intent on hiring every single woman who wanted to work in the city of Portland and beyond. And of course, you'll find out in a minute, eventually there weren't enough women to fill those positions. Bernice Thompson, a Portland African-American, recalled the Kaiser recruiter who canvassed her neighborhood, her albino neighborhood that is in Northeast Portland. And the recruiter announced to all who would listen, quote, "I don't care if you have an education or not. We will find the job for you at the shipyards if you're willing to work." By 1942, Kaiser had hired so many women and so many non-traditional workers, meaning blacks and Latinos and Native Americans and even some Asians who were around, that the Boilermakers Union for the Kaiser Yard said, "These new Kaiser workers represent a bottom-of-the-barrel assortment of shoe clerks, soda jerks, professors, pimps, and old maids." I don't know what's worse. I mean, the professors or the pimps. but these literally are the people who are coming into the yards. And in case you think this is an exaggeration, I was actually, 20 years ago, I was fortunate to interview some of the people who worked in the yards. And a couple of people that I interviewed were actually people who had left their jobs at Washington State University to go to work in the shipyards. Indeed, the shipyards paid more money than Washington State University, and I dare say they probably paid more money than the University of Washington or other places as well. Yet, even with all of these people who were swept up into the Kaiser Yards, there was still a huge regional labor shortage, as became evident by late 1942. At that point, Kaiser went to the federal government, he went to the Roosevelt administration, and he received permission from the federal government to recruit workers from the East. Now, this is no easy feat because the East Coast has its own labor shortages, and Kaiser is in effect talking about moving labor from one area where there's a shortage to another area. But he was able to persuade the Roosevelt administration to allow this, and thus, between 1942 and the middle of 1943, Kaiser would recruit, and I mean the company now, Kaiser would recruit 38,000 workers on so-called Liberty trains that would specially originate that originated in New York City, especially for these people to come out to Portland. In other words, Kaiser is saying we are going to move people from the east to the west to where the jobs are. But for our discussion, for the purposes of our discussion, the people who are going to come not from New York City, they're going to come from the south. And they're going to come because Kaiser pays some of the best wages in the country. Indeed, there's another flyer that Kaiser put out in 1943 that reflects on almost a patriotic duty of people to come and work in the shipyards in Portland. Let me read to you part of what that flyer said. There's a job of vital importance to your company waiting for you in the Portland shipyards. You can learn a trade, get paid while you're learning, and earn the highest wages for comparable work anywhere in the world. That's not far from the truth. There were some exceptions here, but indeed, this was the call. This was the call that went out not just to New York, it also went out to Louisiana, it also went out to Texas, it also went out to Tennessee, it also went out to Oklahoma, and a huge number of, far more whites responded to this, obviously, but a huge number of African Americans would make their way. Wartime migration soon assumed a momentum independent of Kaiser's recruiting. In other words, Kaiser didn't have to recruit anymore. Black workers wrote home describing the conditions, particularly the high wages, the fact that it seemed that racial conditions were better in Portland. And they also talked about the, quote, mild climate in Portland in the winter. And as a result, by the end of 1943, nearly 75% of the black migrants to Oregon came independently of Kaiser recruitment. In other words, this migration was taking place on its own, that people were deciding to come to the Pacific Northwest and specifically to the Kaiser yards in Oregon because of the job opportunities. We've already talked about the states, or I've suggested the states that would send the largest number of workers: Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. They would contribute, not surprisingly, a disproportionate number of African American newcomers. I should say, though, and this is something that's not generally known, 53% of the people who would go to work in the Kaiser plant, the Kaiser shipyards, were women. 53% of the black people who would go to work in these shipyards were women. Many of them were married, many of them were not. But the very fact that these were black women working in the yard sort of undermines the image of the single male shipyard worker. And that was the image that we had had through most of our history, that this is a man's job. Well, all of a sudden, women were now filling these jobs. As a matter of fact, the Oregon Shipbuilding Company, one of the Kaiser facilities in Portland, became in 1941 the first yard in the nation to hire women in non-clerical posts. By 1943, women comprised 40% of all the shipyard workers in Portland, Vancouver. Let me repeat that. By 1943, women were 40% of all the shipyard workers in Portland, Vancouver. But black women were a majority of the African Americans in the yards. Wartime labor demands guaranteed black women and men that they would work, but they did not necessarily guarantee equal treatment. Throughout the war, black workers, shipyard managers, and union officials engaged in what I call the three-way struggle over so-called workplace segregation and worker assignments. In a bewildering order of job allocation by the shipyard unions and the managers, black workers could build ships, but they couldn't repair them. Black workers could clean ships, but they couldn't paint them. Black workers could weld steel plates, but they couldn't weld steel pipes. Now, for someone outside, I don't know the difference here, but apparently this was very important to the Kaiser people, and as a result, a system of discrimination began to emerge in the yards, even though people were receiving very, very good pay. Doris Mae Williams, originally a Kaiser shipyard welder, that is, she was hired as a welder, took a job as a laborer rather than suffer from continued abuse from her supervisor, who said over and over again that she wasn't qualified to be a welder. Eventually, and not just the supervisor, but also the co-workers as well, who made her life very, very difficult. Eventually, she wrote to the FEPC, and this is how we have the record of it. She says, quote, "I am now scaling," meaning she's cleaning the hulls of ships. "I am now scaling. It is hard work, but our crew is mixed, and we are all treated alike. Why couldn't the same be said for the skilled workers? Why couldn't the same be said for the skilled workers?" Eventually, labor shortages and production demands broke down somewhat somewhat this arcane racial classification. But most black workers remained in unskilled work for the rest of the war. Let me repeat that. Most black workers remained in unskilled work for the rest of the war. Two barriers were rarely ever crossed. In one instance, black men and black women, regardless of education or experience, did not become clerical workers, or in other instances, they did not become supervisors. In other words, they couldn't work in the office, they couldn't handle the paperwork in the office, and they could not become supervisors. As a matter of fact, one of the shipyard managers spoke to that very question in 1944. He had just established a system whereby blacks could head all black crews, but then he argued that blacks should never supervise whites. And then he said it like this: we wouldn't ask white people to work under a Negro, and we shouldn't expect them to. We wouldn't ask white people to work under a Negro, and we shouldn't expect them to. In other words, there was progress, and then there was not. In other words, there was progress. Black people were working in jobs that they had never had before, the kinds of jobs they had never had before. They were making a great deal of money, and they were certainly in many instances outside of the South. But racial discrimination still existed. Marginalization still existed, even in what were considered to be some of the best jobs in the country. After jobs, housing was the greatest challenge facing black workers in Portland, especially the migrants. And you can understand the situation. As I said before, about 1,900 blacks lived in Portland, and mostly in the Albina district. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Albina. It's now called Northeast Portland. Those 1,900 blacks lived in Albina before the war, and they lived essentially in a mixed area. That is, there were whites in Albina as well, but blacks could only live in Albina. Whites could live anywhere in town. They could move out of Albina. Blacks could not because of restrictive covenants. And of course, what happens then is that all of these newcomers come in, and the restricted covenants still hold, and as a result, there's a doubling and tripling up in the city. Now, to be sure, everybody in Portland was going to be crowded. In other words, Portland's population went from about 300,000 to 400,000 in the 4 years of the war, and so there were a lot of people who were sleeping and living under atrocious conditions. But for black folks who already suffered from the restrictive covenants, the situation was going to be even worse. Black folks were living essentially in garages when they got a chance, and the garages were the better facilities. They were sleeping in churches because the churches sometimes opened their doors to them. They were sleeping in basements when they were lucky enough to have basements. And in some instances, black workers were actually living in chicken coops. Now, it's amazing because these people were making more money than they'd ever made before. So money wasn't the issue. The fact that they were making money, unfortunately, did not negate the inability of these folks to find suitable housing. The situation became so very bad that Henry Kaiser stepped in again. And he decided that he wanted to try to alleviate the housing shortage by actually building houses, because he realized that without housing, he couldn't get the workers that he needed, or the workers wouldn't stay, and therefore the ships wouldn't be built. But unfortunately, Kaiser ran into opposition from the civic leaders in Portland, the business leaders in Portland, who said that they didn't want public housing. And as a result, Kaiser again had to go to the White House. He had to go to the President of the United States and get a special dispensation to create a remarkable community that would be known eventually as Vanport. These are images from Vanport. And just to put a perspective on this, Vanport would be the world's largest war housing city. In other words, it would be the largest single housing project built anywhere in the world, as far as we can determine, unless there's something in the Soviet Union that we don't know about, anywhere in the world in the World War II period. To put it in perspective, Vanport would eventually have 42,000 inhabitants or residents, and as such, it would become the second largest city in Oregon, second only to Portland itself. Vanport, as I said before, was the nation's largest wartime housing facility, and actually this is proof. You can see the number of units that were built by the federal government for the Kaiser workers, and you can see them in comparison to much larger cities. Los Angeles and New York, of course, pale in comparison to what was going to take place in Vanport. But let me give you an example, or let me give you kind of a reminder of the scale of this community that's established essentially in the lowlands between Vancouver and North Portland. 10,000 prefabricated housing units were going to be built in less than a year to house the workers in Vanport. Interestingly, 1/3 of the construction workers who built these houses were women. This virtually self-contained city had 5 grade schools, 6 nursery schools, and eventually it had Vanport College, out of which emerged Portland State University. Vanport also had 3 fire stations, a U.S. post office, a police station, a movie theater, a 130-bed hospital, a library, and 16 playgrounds. In other words, this really was a community. And it was a community that, how will I say this? It was a community that tried to come to grips with race. There were attempts to try to integrate facilities, as you can see here, this Bible study class, but also there was an informal segregation, housing segregation going on, because virtually all of the blacks were by custom, not by law, but by custom, confined to the south end of the Vanport area along Cottonwood Avenue. By 1945, half of Portland's 22,000 black residents resided in the city of Portland, and the other half were in Vanport. Whether they lived in Portland proper or Vanport, that is in the housing project in Vanport, they were racially segregated. That is, the housing was racially segregated. A Portland Urban League official made the linkage between segregated housing and societal well-being when he declared in 1945, a man who must crowd his wife and children into an unsafe and unsanitary home becomes an unstable citizen. Becomes an unstable citizen. Restrictive covenants, of course, were the cause of deteriorating housing. And the covenants had existed long before World War II, and they existed not just in Portland. As you're going to see, they existed in Seattle and a whole host of other cities across the country. There were 3 solutions to this situation. The first solution would be for the community, the white community, to have reduced or eliminated its opposition to the black presence and allow blacks to live anywhere in the city. In other words, residential integration. But I'll be honest with you, that was the option that was least likely to happen in the 1940s. The second option was to build more public housing in Portland, not just the Vanport community, but to build public housing and disperse it throughout Portland. However, Portland officials, supported by the Chamber of Commerce and other civic groups, discouraged the construction of new housing. They were already angry that Kaiser had gotten Vanport, and they drew the line and said there will be no other significant public housing projects in Portland. And essentially, they made the argument, it was very, very clear, they made the argument that if we build public housing, we literally invite the blacks, and in some instances, the southern whites, to stay. As one city official remarked in 1945, he and his colleagues, quote, wish that most of the Negroes would go back home, leaving our city untouched by racial problems. And of course, the way to effect that is to deny the Negroes housing. And remember I said before that there's a reason the black population increased to 22,000 and then declined. I think one of the reasons it declined is obviously because the shipyards themselves closed down. But I think another reason for that decline was that Portland city officials, and of course in many instances ordinary citizens in Portland, made it very, very clear that black folks were not welcome. They made it very clear that African Americans were not welcome. And some of those blacks ended up coming up here to Seattle. Some of them ended up going down to Los Angeles. They went everywhere except to stay in Portland. But some did. Indeed, as you saw from the census figures earlier, about 9,000 black folks. Again, a 300% increase in the population. About 9,000 blacks would remain in Portland through the end of the year. They would, in effect, try to survive what I call the housing crisis, but a housing crisis that in some ways was contrived, a housing crisis that in some ways was orchestrated in order to keep African Americans out of the city. But they, even the city fathers, wouldn't be and couldn't possibly be prepared for Mother Nature. They couldn't possibly be prepared for Mother Nature. On Memorial Day in 1948, there was a flood that literally wiped away, washed away the Vanport community. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Vanport flood, but it was horrible, it was horrendous, and I'll give you some illustrations here. This is the damage. You can see these are prefabricated houses and they are taken away. A dike broke along the Columbia River. There was flooding, along the river. The dike broke. Gee, this sounds like Katrina. Sounds like and essentially the water rushed in, and you can see the damage. You can see the tremendous damage. Although this is not Katrina because it's on a much smaller scale, it is Katrina in terms of the impact on the community. And I'll give you some visual representation of this. You can see the people streaming, and these are lucky. These are lucky people. We don't know exactly how many people died, but the best estimate is about 15 people died in Vanport. But there are other estimates that the number was far higher because a lot of people's bodies were never recovered. You can see people trying to get out. And as I took these pictures, as I did these scans, I could almost sense that we're doing Katrina again. That essentially this was kind of a precursor to what would happen in New Orleans later. This is my editorial comment, guys, but I just want to throw that in. And of course, the flood and the aftermath. It would take years before many of these people would be readjusted into the Portland community. Right there at the bottom, you can see the Red Cross. And here you can see very clearly the Red Cross helping both blacks and whites. And you can see, notice this is not just about black folks. There are white folks who are also going to be made homeless by the flood. And as I said, it would take years, perhaps even a decade, before many of these people were going to have their lives restored as a consequence of this flood. In other words, this was in some ways a parallel to, obviously one couldn't predict Katrina, but this was in many ways a parallel to what would happen in New Orleans. I was struck by this as I tried to organize these slides. But the larger point here is that black folks had come to the West, they had come to the Pacific Northwest, specifically they had come to Portland, and they had come to an uncertain welcome. And with that, let me talk about Seattle, and I'm going to try to shorten this to some extent because a lot of what happened in Portland, at least in terms of blacks getting to the scene, is going to be duplicated in Seattle, except maybe on a slightly smaller scale. Blacks, of course, come to Seattle initially to work in the shipyard industries, not Boeing, but to work in the shipyards. And of course, there are a number of shipyards. I think we've forgotten our shipbuilding heritage here in Seattle, but we were a major port or a major area for shipbuilding in the 1940s, or at least through the World War II period as well. But by 1943, the focus of black employment is going to shift, just as the focus of employment for most workers is going to shift to Boeing. Boeing is going to be the major employer. And look at that image on the right. I just want to comment on it. That's a remarkable scene. This is a war bond rally at Boeing Field in 1943. It's hard to imagine a scene like that even today. Maybe it could happen, but I think we've rarely seen anything like this. But this shows you the tremendous impact that Boeing has on the local economy. These are workers, and they're obviously not all of the workers at Boeing, but these are workers at Boeing in the middle of World War II. As I said, by 1943, most African Americans who were coming to Seattle were coming to work at Boeing. By the end of the war, 4,000 black folks worked in the shipyards out of 60,000 workers, and 1,200 of 42,000 aircraft construction workers in Seattle were African American. Of course, in Seattle, when we talk about aircraft construction, that's all Boeing. Despite this shortage of workers in Seattle's defense industries, some industrialists and some labor leaders opposed the hiring of African Americans. This is labor power. This is the march of the Boeing Union, the Aero Mechanics Union, Local 751, and I want to talk about 751 in a minute. But again, it's a remarkable scene that I don't think will be duplicated anytime soon in the streets of Seattle. But these are workers marching to Seattle City Hall. Notice they're not marching on Boeing, they're marching on City Hall, and they're marching for political reasons as much as economic reasons, and it reflects on the tremendous power of the Boeing workforce in the city at that moment. But unfortunately, that Boeing workforce was divided, at least initially, about whether African Americans would be included among them. As a matter of fact, after Executive Order 8802, the Northwest Enterprise, which of course was the leading black newspaper in Seattle, essentially continued. Notice I didn't say it began. It continued its campaign to try to integrate Boeing. As a matter of fact, the newspaper said in September 26 of 1941, this is 3 months after the executive order, the president's memorandum issued to quiet the rising tide of Negroes' protests falls on deaf ears in the far Northwest. And the newspaper had good reason for that pessimism in 1941. Boeing, in its 25-year history, had never hired an African American for any capacity, not even as a janitor. Moreover, that pattern seemed unlikely to change. In the 10-week period after Executive Order 8802 became law, the company hired 1,000 new employees per week, but none of them were African American. Not a single one was an African American. In response to this, the black community, the small black community, organized. The black churches, the fraternal organizations, the political clubs organized a committee, what I think the longest name in African American history, the Committee for the Defense of the Negro's Right to Work at Boeing Airplane Company. But you know the idea. The idea was to try to get political change. The idea was to use the might of the federal government on one hand, to use the power of the African American community on the other, to try to integrate Local 751, which was the International Association of Machinists, or the Aero Mechanics Union. Ultimately, pressure from the committee, pressure from the federal government, and most importantly, the growing labor shortage forced Boeing and the Aircraft Workers Union, Local 751, to allow the first black production workers at the Seattle aircraft plant in the spring of 1942. Nonetheless, some union leaders were still displeased at even the temporary, and this was called at that time a temporary opening, the temporary opening of Boeing to black workers and other people of color and to women. And only because of the huge labor shortage was something done. James Duncan, a representative for Local 751 of the International Association of Machinists, said this: "We have officially gone on record as agreeing to live up to the letter and spirit of the executive order. At the same time, we rather resent that the war situation has been used to alter an old established custom and do not feel it would be helpful to war production." The old established custom is racial discrimination, guys, in case you didn't know. And they said this wouldn't be helpful for war production. Let me make a footnote. Let me make an aside to this, and it's a very important aside. There was the committee with the long name, that is, of African Americans who were working to try to integrate Boeing from outside. But there was also a group of men, and all men, remember, because Boeing didn't have any female workers, as production workers at that time. There were a group of men within the union who were trying to integrate the union as well. Some called them communists. I don't know if they were or not, but that was an easy charge to level, because these were individuals who were dedicated to trying to change the pattern of racial discrimination. And one of those people was Hugo Lundquist. And you can't tell, well, you may not be able to tell, but go to the very top of that image. You see the man speaking out the window? That's Lundquist, and he's addressing members of Local 741. And essentially, I use this image to show you that there's actually a battle going on within the union. That is, there are those within the union who are trying to integrate it from the inside, just as though there are those who are struggling from the outside to try to integrate the union. Unfortunately for Lundquist and the others who were trying to integrate the union, they were going to be accused of being communists. There was going to be a trial of these men, and there were other charges that were brought against them as well. But one of the issues was the fact that they were trying to integrate the union, and as a result, they were expelled. As a result, they were expelled. That, fortunately, was not the end of it, because by 1942, the labor shortage would eventually allow African Americans to work in Boeing. And I want to go to the next slide. This is Dorothy West Williams. She is the first production worker at the Boeing Airplane Company in 1942. And I think it's significant that the very first production worker was a black woman. The very first of the blacks who worked in production was a black woman. And indeed, this would be the situation in Boeing throughout those years, throughout the World War II years. To give you some statistics on this, by July of 1943, African American women constituted 86% of the 329 black employees at Boeing. In other words, this was a female workforce. These were women who were going to work to build the planes, to build the B-17 bombers, and eventually the B-25 bombers that would be so effective in destroying the Nazis and eventually forcing the Japanese to surrender. Wartime job demands had finally broken 7 decades of an employment pattern in Seattle. We're not talking about the rest of the country, but in Seattle, where the majority of black workers, and particularly black women, were unskilled laborers and specifically domestic servants. As one African-American woman said, and she's talking about black women at Boeing, and I want to talk about this image in a minute. It was Hitler who got us out of white folks' kitchens. It was Hitler who got us out of white folks' kitchens. I think that was a profound statement. I want to talk about this image. This is, just as an aside, I know we're always pressed for time here, but I want to say something about this. This is an image that was lost to all of us, that was lost to historians, lost to the community until about a year and a half ago. The union, the IAM union, was tearing down its old building, and in the process of the demolition, a cache of old photographs was found, and this was one of those photographs. This is a remarkable photograph. It shows black women standing in front of the plane, the type of plane that they built, that they helped to build in 1944. And it shows the role of African American women in the Boeing company at that time. African Americans were discriminated against, even in the Boeing factory, just as they continue to be discriminated against in the factories, the shipyards, I should say, in Portland. But nonetheless, African Americans in Seattle gained enormous prestige from receiving high wage-paying jobs. In other words, Boeing paid more than the shipyards. As a matter of fact, the shipyard employers were upset because Boeing paid more. And from knowing that they were holding down jobs that were comparable to those held by whites, and from knowing that indeed they were part of the movement or part of the effort to try to bring about the destruction of the Nazis and to protect and literally save the United States. But before I leave the discussion of Boeing, I want to show this other slide. And this shows the other side. Not only are African Americans being changed by what's going on at Boeing, but the rest of society is being changed as well. This is Inez Sawyer. I don't know if she's a typical worker, but read her words, because they show something about the way in which the war and the close proximity of these black and white women in the workplace is in effect challenging age-old customs, age-old ideas about the proper place of African Americans and other people of color in society. Boeing provided good jobs, and that's obviously a plus. Boeing provided the opportunity for African Americans to make a substantial amount of money, even though, again, there was the housing shortage in Seattle, just as it existed in Portland and elsewhere. But good jobs at high wages could still not prevent the rise of racial tension. And there was a tremendous amount of racial tension in Seattle, as it was all over the country. Now, in the rest of the country, that racial tension spilled over into violence. This is Detroit. This is the image that a lot of African Americans remember all too well. Detroit had the worst race ride as far as African Americans were concerned. The worst race ride was probably the Zoot Suit ride, but Detroit had the worst race ride in the country in 1943, but not the only one. Not the only one. Detroit was in some ways kind of representative of the growing tensions, because essentially what you have are African American workers who are either coming to places like Detroit and Seattle and establishing themselves, establishing their presence as workers with their sense of equality, and going against, again, those age-old practices of discrimination, going against those who decided that African Americans should remain in their place. And of course, this tension would grow in Seattle. And I want to speak to this. Actually, I want to let you read what a Seattle mayor said about this in 1944. This is Seattle Mayor William F. Devon. Devon actually created the Seattle Civic Unity Committee, which was an organization, a remarkable organization, to try to bring people together and to do so in a way to reduce racial tensions. We don't know the whole story, but what little we can piece together suggests that there were many riots, in other words, small riots, in the shipyards, at the Boeing plant, and certainly there were confrontations between blacks and whites on street buses and in downtown Seattle in 1943, 1944, 1945. That's kind of a hidden history. A lot of us would find it hard to imagine that this was going on in Seattle. And yet you can see the words of the mayor. He knew it was going on, and he had to address it at that time. As you can see, and I'll read his last words. If we don't do that, that is, if we don't deal with this issue of race, we shall not exist very long as a civilized city or as a nation. As a civilized city or as a nation. And why is he speaking to this? because there is a problem. Not only is there racial tension, but there are also growing manifestations of racial discrimination. For instance, for the first time, at least in the memory of the old residents, "We cater to white trade only" signs began to appear in stores in Seattle. This is something that a lot of people thought was sort of limited to the South, limited to the East. Now these kinds of signs were beginning to pop up in Seattle, and of course, this was disturbing. There were other examples of racial discrimination, and indeed, the Northwest Enterprise was going to do important work to try to root out this discrimination all over. Look at these headlines. Well, I like the one. Jim Crow parades Madrona Theater. Can you imagine a theater in Madrona excluding black folks? It's hard to imagine, but that's exactly what the situation was in World War II. And you can see what's going on. Protests, NAACP protests segregation on Pasco buses. You didn't have to go very far. The situation in Bremerton. You didn't have to go very far to see examples of racial discrimination. But you also didn't have to go very far to see a lot of people, a lot of good people, white, black, Asian, who were coming to defend against that kind of discrimination. We talked, for instance, about the NAACP, and the NAACP was certainly in the forefront of this defense against discrimination. The NAACP led the campaign. But there was one interesting, almost remarkable organization that emerges in Seattle that needs to be mentioned in this struggle as well, and that was the Christian Friends for Racial Equality. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. I know some of us are familiar with the Christian Friends. The Christian Friends was started by a group of concerned citizens, a group of people who were concerned about the growing racial tension. These were white and black folks who were concerned. One of the people who was instrumental in the organization in its very early years was none other than Dorothy Bullitt. My chair is named after her, and I have to confess to you, I thought for a long time that Dorothy Bullitt was a socialite, was essentially a club woman. I didn't realize that she was one of the most powerful businesswomen in Seattle until I came here, and that shows my ignorance, and I will confess to all about that. What I did realize, though, was that she spoke up early against racial discrimination, that she was one of the people that wanted to be counted in the campaign. Now, did she do enough? Did any of these folks do enough? Who knows? But what we do know is that at a time when most people were turning a deaf ear to this, at a time when most people weren't getting engaged in the campaign against racial discrimination, the Christian Friends for Racial Equality were stepping forward. This is, as I said, this is a unique organization. They were larger even than the NAACP, and they were involved in campaigns as significant as the NAACP, not just in the 1940s, but through the 1950s. As a matter of fact, I think they finally disbanded in the early 1960s. As in Portland, African-American newcomers face chronic housing shortages, and of course the housing shortages were, as always, exacerbated by restrictive covenants. The restrictive covenants essentially forced 10,000 black folks in Seattle to live in accommodations that have been designed to hold about 3,500. And so obviously there's the doubling up, obviously there's the tension that comes from this. But Seattle is remarkable in the sense that there was one visionary individual, a man named Jesse Epstein, who directed the Seattle Housing Authority, who almost by sheer will, almost by sheer defiance, said, "We are not going to allow segregation in Yesler Terrace." Yesler Terrace, as many of you may know, is one of the oldest public housing projects in the country. Or maybe you don't know that. It is one of the oldest public housing projects in the country. It also holds the distinction of being one of the few integrated housing projects in the country. Jesse Epstein was involved in a great social experiment, and these are his words, not mine, but involved in a great social experiment to try to make sure that there would at least be one public housing project in Seattle. Not all of the projects were integrated, but to make sure that one project would be integrated. And you can see to some extent the consequences of this. This is extremely unusual. This is extraordinary in a time when almost all of the rest of the country was going in the opposite direction. African-American Seattle was itself bitterly divided over the influx of the migrants. There were, as I said before, the old settlers, the people who had arrived before December 7th, 1941, And of course, there were the newcomers, the migrants. And of course, the newcomers generated all kinds of images, most of which, at least in the minds of the old settlers, were negative. The newcomers were the sharecroppers. The newcomers were the folks up from the south. Look carefully at these images because I'm sort of playing with them for a minute. You see on the left and on the right, these are clearly black folks. The people in the middle are actually white. The people in the middle, that's a white couple in the middle. But when most folks talked about the migrants and all that the migrants stood for and all that they represented, they were almost always, almost invariably, talking about African Americans. African Americans were seen as the people who were, quote, culturally foreign because they had come from somewhere else and because they didn't know the ways of the city. And of course, this created a tremendous amount of tension. Listen to the words of Leetta King, one of the black women in Seattle at the time. I know that I was quite ashamed of them. They looked so bad. The women wearing dungarees and their heads tied up with a handkerchief. I just tried not to see them. And of course, there are numerous quotes like this. Old settlers resented these people coming in, as you can see here. They thought that the situation for all black folks would be made worse by these newcomers. They believed that somehow or another the delicate balance of race would be permanently altered by the newcomers. Well, in that regard, they were right. In that regard, they were right. But they assumed that they would somehow or another suffer because of this. As another old-timer said, Melvina Squires, these people were pretty conspicuous, meaning the newcomers, the migrants. These people were pretty conspicuous. They were loud, they were happy, they were crude. And of course, that was juxtaposed against the image of the settlers, or the old settlers, or the blacks who had been here for a long time. I will say, though, that not every one of the old settlers felt this way. Listen to the words of Armetta Hest in a 1968 interview. She's describing what I call the myopia of a lot of her contemporaries. She said, we were always talking about these sharecroppers. We're all sharecroppers. We just got here first. The migrants had their own set of grievances against the old settlers. The migrants felt that the old settlers hadn't done enough to fight for civil rights. They felt that the old settlers had been too quiet on questions of racial discrimination. And they certainly believed that this notion of racial progress and the notion of good race relations was grossly exaggerated. And they believed that it was grossly exaggerated, not simply because they had come, but because essentially the old settlers had been too passive, too willing to accept the old standard. Eventually, the mutual hostility between the old settlers and the migrants faded. Community leaders created the Association for Tolerance, which operated out of the two leading black churches in September of 1943. And the Association for Tolerance was created, quote, for the purpose of orienting our new residents into our way of life. The migration of the 1940s altered the racial configuration of Seattle, making blacks, for the first time in the city's history, the largest racial minority. That is, they replaced Japanese Americans. And of course, we know Japanese Americans were removed from the city in 1941, 1942. But even had the Japanese population remained in the city, blacks would have been the overwhelming majority. Blacks would have outnumbered them. And of course, there's a problem. There's an unfortunate corollary to the coming of blacks, particularly blacks who in many instances had no experience with the Japanese. Now, I don't want to go too far with this. I don't want to suggest that the African Americans and Japanese Americans had absolutely no tension between them before World War II. I think it would be naive to say that. But certainly, when you compare the situation in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Oakland, there was far less tension and far more cooperation between Japanese Americans in Seattle and blacks or African Americans in Seattle than in any of the other cities on the West Coast. Some of that, much of that, was shattered by World War II. As African Americans came in from the South, and to be honest with you, as African Americans sort of absorbed the generalized racial discourse of the time that tended to demonize all Japanese people. Remember, we're fighting in a war against Imperial Japan, and there were the worst caricatures, I don't have examples of this, but there were the worst caricatures of the Japanese that you could imagine on buildings right here in downtown Seattle. You don't have to go very far to see these things. And as a result, there was a general rising of tension, or an increase in tension against the Japanese. And of course, black people shared in these beliefs. Black people, in effect, became increasingly dismissive of the Japanese and ultimately of the Japanese Americans. As one internee said when he returned to Seattle, when he returned to his home on Jackson Street, he said, for the first time, I felt persecuted, but the persecutors spoke in the accent of the persecuted. The persecutors spoke in the accent of the persecuted. In other words, he was saying that African Americans were now engaged in persecution of Japanese Americans. Fortunately, again, Seattle's model is different from that of the other cities. In the other cities, the tension continued to grow, and there seemed to be very little that anyone would do to stop it. But in Seattle, a remarkable organization, the Jackson Street Community Council, was formed in 1946. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say that the Jackson Street Community Council was formed to deal with racial tension. They were actually nothing more, nothing less than the typical neighborhood association that's concerned about getting the garbage picked up, concerned about police protection, concerned about making sure that all the members of the business association pay their dues and keep their stores up and all the rest. But in the process of doing so, they were engaged in what I call race work. They were engaged in work that would eventually result in the lowering of tensions between and among Asian Americans and African Americans. I won't get into all of the detail here, but I want to go to the next image, and I want to hold it up for a minute. The Jackson Street Community Council would stage all these elaborate pageants. This is one in 1952, the crowning of Miss International Center. And in 1952, the first Miss International Center was Adele Avery, a black woman. And there was a conscious effort to try to essentially rotate the officers among the Jackson Street Community Council, among Filipino Americans, among Chinese Americans, among Japanese Americans, and of course among African Americans. Again, I don't know if they said they were doing this in order to try to eliminate the racial problem, but in the process of doing so, they were creating a model for interracial cooperation that would extend well into the 1960s and beyond. The migration of African Americans to Seattle during World War II would continue into the post-war decade. Unlike Portland, where many black people left. Indeed, Portland lost over half of its black population. Half of its 1945 black population had left the city by 1949, 1950. Just the opposite happened in Seattle. Seattle had 10,000 black folks in 1945. By 1950, it would have 15,000. Part of that has to do with, unfortunately, the Cold War. Part of it has to do with the fact that Boeing would continue to grow. Even though World War II was over, we were in the Cold War certainly by 1947, 1948, and as a result, Boeing would prosper, and that Boeing prosperity would result in African Americans continuing to come to Seattle, and in many instances, either working for Boeing itself or working in a city that was made prosperous by Boeing. As a result, Seattle blacks seem to have a pretty good life. As a matter of fact, I want to bring up this next image. This is, I think, a remarkable image at a number of levels. This is Our World magazine, and for those of you who don't know, this was a magazine that was the rival to Ebony. Unfortunately, they didn't survive. Ebony did, okay? But they wrote about Seattle in August of 1951, and they said literally that this is the best place in the country for black folks. And they talked about the kind of integrated living facilities there. And what you see, the picture you see here is, what is it? This is Rainier Vista. This is Rainier Vista. This is a completely different image of Rainier Vista that we would have in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And of course, there are people working to try to bring back this image, those people who are trying to redevelop Rainier Vista to this day. But in 1947, 1948, 1949, Rainier Vista was the example, kind of the model of a racially integrated community. All of this augured well, all this spoke well for African Americans in Seattle. As I said, other places envied Seattle. The people in Chicago, the people at the Chicago Defender said Seattle was the best place to come, and indeed urged blacks to leave Chicago, urged blacks to leave the South and come to Seattle. Not all of them did, obviously, because Seattle's population didn't grow that much. But the very fact that Seattle seemed, for one brief moment, the promised land, tended to make national news at that point. Moreover, there were a number of what I call firsts. And I guess I have some ambivalence about even talking about first, because when you talk about the first this person and the first that person, you're also talking about the long legacy of discrimination. But on the other hand, there were people who were going to move into areas or engage in activities that they hadn't engaged in before. And these are two of the firsts in Seattle. Thelma DeWitty, the first school teacher, and John Prim, the first judge in 1950. These are remarkable individuals, but they are two of a number of individuals that are emerging at that particular time. This list could go on and on and on. There are probably about 12 names that I could list here, but I won't do it in the interest of time. There was also political growth, and I'm glad Larry's in the back to hear this, Larry Gossett, our county councilman, because African Americans were increasingly active politically in the World War II period. Indeed, it was the migration that spurred that activity because there was a much larger black community. In January 1946, Reverend F. Benjamin Davis, and by the way, here he is in the middle of this slide, and I love that outfit he has on. But Reverend F. Benjamin Davis, the pastor of Mount Zion, enters the race for a city council seat. With the endorsement of organized labor, Davis garners 27,000 votes in a city that had only 3,500 black voters. He lost his council bid, but just barely. But nonetheless, he set the stage, or he proved the point, that African Americans could run successfully in a predominantly white city. He proved that African Americans could actually gain votes from people outside of the African American community. And of course, the man who would prove this even more so was Republican Attorney Charles Stokes. We saw him at the very beginning. Charles Stokes was elected to the 37th legislative seat, and he became the city's first African American representative in Olympia. Seattle's expanding economy, based in the early 1950s on defense spending, prompted by the Cold War. And again, kind of the paradox here. You know, the tension in the world generates prosperity for Seattle that some African Americans benefit from. Created a city that seemed capable of absorbing all of these white and black newcomers. The economic growth, however, unfortunately, hid a lot of growing problems. There was a rising tide of segregation in the public schools. We won't talk about that tonight, but I'm certainly going to spend a lot of time on that next week. There was growing poverty even in the midst of prosperity, and there was a growing concentration of black folks in the central district. In other words, the ghetto was increasing. It was not declining by any respect, in any regard at that time. And indeed, the euphoria about Seattle's race relations would ultimately be challenged in the late 1950s and the early 1960s by what I call the civil rights movement right here in Seattle. But that, folks, is another lecture, next week's lecture, and so we'll stop at this point. Thank you very much.